I'm alive, I'm alive. I am not your typical girl. Throw away that picture in your head. I am not your typical girl. Work harder, now work harder. Running from myself, way I try. Falling for myself, it's taking time to know I'm blind. Oh, I am different. I am different. I am. What is it with you independent men? It's always something threatening your masculine energy. You think it's fleeting. Nothing you ain't give to me I can take away from you now. Let me be, I'm trying to fly. You insist on clipping my way. From myself, way I try. Falling for myself, it's taking time to know I'm blind. Curl in the middle of my forehead, I'm dead. Take a picture if you want me quiet. I said, sweet like the candy and just set disperse on Sunday, but I'm bitter when you try to hold me back. Must be disconcerting how I discombobulate your mood. I always been the only, every classroom, every home. Kiss of chocolate on the moon, color greeting, silver spoon. Little boxes on the hillside, little boxes you can stick onto me. My weaponry is my energy. I tenderly feel my enemies with white light. You will never know everything, everything. I will never know everything, everything. You will never know everything, everything. And you don't know me, so you up the thing. You will never know everything, everything. I will never know everything, everything. You will never know everything, everything. And you don't know me, couldn't possibly.
Good evening, everyone. Well, it's a dark and stormy night here in Chicago, and we're really thankful to be here with you all. I'm Tiff Beatty, Program Director of Arts, Culture, and Public Policy at the National Public Housing Museum, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all on this night in Chicago to Black Women's Stories Matter, a story circle with very special guest storytellers, Dr. Barbara Ransby and Dorothy Burge, who we'll meet shortly. I'd like to begin with just a brief word about the inspiration and methodology and also the intentions for this event. We have folks here live on Zoom with us as well as watching on Facebook. So I thank you all for tuning in. As we get into the actual storytelling circles, we'll have some different directions for you all, but you can also write us in the chat if you have any specific questions in the meantime. So John O'Neill was a civil rights activist, playwright, actor, and founder of Free Southern Theater. He formed story circles as an alternative to the traditional theater talkback. He made the methodology available to Ashe Cultural Arts Center and Junebug Productions, who shared the process with the National Public Housing Museum, and we're delighted to share it with you today. Folks who signed up for this event through Eventbrite should have gotten a storytelling circle toolkit. And if you're on Facebook, we also drop that on our event page. So please feel free to check that out. We'll be referencing that throughout the event. But in short, a story circle is a group facilitation process built around narrative and personal experience. A group of people tell personal stories supported by a facilitator and a timekeeper. Story circles are always meant to create a safe space for people to share across different experiences. And tonight's Story Circle was designed as a pre or post-show opportunity in partnership with Stage Left Theater's production of The Projects. It's a riveting play about the life in public housing, and we encourage you to check out their virtual performances, which will run through November 26th. So in addition to adopting John O'Neill's story circle methodology to uplift and respond to this important work, NPHM staff made a deliberate choice with this event to center Black women's voices and experiences from both within and beyond the walls of public housing. We see the history of public housing as the history of America and acknowledge that this history has been shaped by forces of erasure and silencing of Black women's stories and lived experiences through policies and practices at all levels, generation after generation. We support the intentional storytelling spaces for Black men, children, poor folks, and all marginalized identities, but tonight is about Black women. So with that, it is my great honor and privilege to welcome our very special guest storytellers who have so much to teach us about history and also the ongoing, never-ending fight for truth and liberation. Dr. Ransby is a historian, writer, and long-term political activist. She has published dozens of articles and essays in her most recent book, Making All Black Lives Matter, Reimagining Freedom in the 21st Century. She details the extensive movement infrastructure undergirding the movement for the Black Lives Coalition. She writes that these organizations engage in what she calls political quilting of the movement infrastructure, which is what sustains the protests to safeguard our democracy. This term, political quilting, conjures images that can only be properly materialized by our next guest. Dorothy Burge is a fabric and multimedia artist and community activist who is inspired by history and current issues of social justice. Dorothy is a native and current resident of Chicago, a former resident of public housing at LeClaire Courts and Washington Park scattered sites, though she is a descendant from a long line of quilters who hailed from Mississippi. So I know I could never do your bios justice in just such a short amount of time, but I would love for you to introduce yourselves, and also if you wouldn't mind just responding to the prompt that has brought us here today. John O'Neill says that art contributes to the way people live, confront, and solve problems. How do you see the role of art in storytelling in your life and work? As you introduce yourselves, if you could also answer that question. And Barbara, we'll start with you.
Well, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for this opportunity. I've been in lots of webinars over the last number of months, trying to figure out how to get out of this political mess we're in. And this one is quite refreshing because it's an invitation to imagine, to think outside the box a little bit, and to embrace storytelling and art. And my dear friend Lisa Lee is involved, and to be on the program with Tiff and Dorothy Burge, who is, one of my artistic heroines, is just really a treat. So yeah, so that quote, for me, art is what I bolster myself with when I go into a difficult situation. It is how I ground myself when I feel unmoored. It is how I stretch and reach when I feel in confined settings. And art includes, it can be a song by Jamila Woods or a poem by Marge Piercy or a play by Christiana Colon, you know, or you know, a jazz ballad, you know, by Nina Simone. So all of that art really helps me to remember and reconnect with why I do the work that I do, both the academic work, but also the political work. And you know, I think sometimes, you know, people think of art as an escape or a refuge in some way. But for me, it's really a grounding. It's not getting away from, but getting back to. And so I appreciate that quote by John O'Neill. And in terms of storytelling in particular, you know, I'm a biographer. I guess this is by way of my introduction. I grew up in Detroit, and I eventually went away to school and became a historian. And I write biographies. I write biographies of Black women. And in some ways, that's a kind of storytelling, right? It's talking about someone's life in kind of elongated fashion, really uh, taking us on a journey through another person's life and trying to tell that story in a compelling and hopefully accurate way. But it's, you know, that has been very nourishing for me in terms of grappling with bigger questions, grappling with large ideas, but doing it through the life of, you know, real people who had real challenges and real flaws, but who nevertheless made history. So that's what I think about when I think about storytelling.
For sure. Thank you for that. And Dorothy, make sure you're unmute. Oh,
Okay, there we go. Um, I started doing quilting years ago, about 30 years ago, because I wanted artwork for my house. And then things started happening in the world that I wanted to document. I come from a long line of quilters. My mother quilted, my grandmother quilted, my great grandmother quilted. And so these quilts were passed down through generations. I did not recognize the value of them until I became older. And then quilting became a way for me to document what's going on as an African American woman and how I am uh, relating to issues that are happening around me. So one of the first public quilts or social justice quilts that I did was for the DuSable Museum. They were having an exhibit on lynching. And I did a quilt of Ida B. Wells. And I also did a quilt of a man by the name of James Cameron. And James Cameron is one of the few African American men who survived a lynching. He was actually strung up in Marion, Indiana, in his teen years. And before he was killed, someone said to cut him down because he didn't do anything. But the two men who were with him actually were killed during this whole process. Meeting him and hearing that story impacted me in such a major way that I felt like I really needed to document that story and document it in a way so that when people came to see the quilt, that they would understand who this man was and why this quilt was documenting the history of this man. And so quilting became a way for me to document history. It became a way for me to encourage people to have really deep discussions about social justice issues in this country. And it also is a way for me to heal and to document issues that are really, really important as African Americans, especially as an African American mother. And if you look at my work, it comes from that perspective. I'm an African American mother, and I create quilts from the perspective of an African American woman.
thank you. Thank you both for that. We started with a quote from Audre Lorde, who we've also, talked about through putting together this event. And, she has an essay that inspired me. I also write poetry and participate in this creative world as much as I can. And her essay, Poetry is Not a Luxury, really speaks to me. And then also, everything that you all are saying, both history and also art making, all of these practices are so important to our work and our life. And so I just want to thank you so much for that, and also transition into our storytelling circle prompt, and a little bit about how we do this, which, as I mentioned earlier, John O'Neill is the inspiration in terms of the methodology. So we do want to stay as closely as possible to his guidelines that he has here. And so I do want to review this before we go ahead and dive in, and just want to remind the folks that are here on Zoom as well as on Facebook that we're going to do a demo here, the three of us, and then we will send folks on Zoom into breakout rooms, and then we'll encourage everyone else, folks on Facebook and folks who weren't able to join us today, to organize their own story circles using the toolkit that we provided. So we really recommend that, you reach out to your friends and family and colleagues and tell them how powerful this tool is and how excited you are to use it as an activity with them, possibly over the holidays, which are coming up. It really is something that we believe in at the museum as a methodology that is very useful as a tool for everything that we're talking about in terms of contributing to our lives and well-being of our communities. So just to go ahead and kick us off, everyone should see the screen. I'm just going to go ahead and actually read through those, and we actually can also drop in the chat now the storytelling toolkit, so folks have that. But I'll just go down the list. So typically the storytelling circle should include 5 to 20 people sitting in a circle. In this case, a virtual space. We ask you to keep your cameras on. So again, the three of us will demonstrate that. No pens, notepads, or pocketbooks. Also, as we're in this virtual space, if you can close all of the extra windows on your laptops and turn off your notifications so that your attention is fully here present with us in this Zoom space, or those of you who are organizing in other spaces, have one facilitator to begin, oversee, and end the circle. So that's me. But for those of you who are going to be, participating in this, that could be you. And you also could be a timekeeper. So the timekeeper could either be the same person as a facilitator or could be a different person. I'd recommend it being a different person just so you can focus. But depending on how big your story circle is, you might want to be flexible there. For us in this demonstration, Barbara and Dorothy will each have 5 minutes for their stories. And we have an MPHM staff that's actually going to time us. And I will take 3 minutes to tell a quick story to kick us off. And then I really also want to emphasize these last few points, which really all kind of go together, which is really our philosophy, that we've borrowed from John O'Neill, is really about listening and allowing silences even within the stories. And so if you finish, we're going to give folks in the breakout rooms 3 minutes. If you finish early, if you could just let the rest of the time, run out and just sit in silence. The silence is okay. And, we appreciate it. And so, if you remember something before your time is up, even though you stopped talking, you can feel free to say that. And so we just want to make sure that everyone gets the full amount of time and everyone gets the same amount of time. And remember that, this is about listening. It's not necessarily about responding to people, but do let your story be influenced or build off of the previous story that you heard. So just as much as you can, try to be in the moment and allow yourself to be influenced, and just really appreciate each other's stories. Really quick, what is and is not a story? A story is a narrative of events drawn from the teller's personal experience, A story can be drawn from a memory, a dream, a reflection, a moment in time, and more. A story typically has a beginning, middle, and end. A story is not a lecture, an argument, nor a debate. Again, I'll read the poem, which is our prompt from Audre Lorde. I'll tell a quick story, 3 minutes. Once I finish the story finish the poem and start the story, that's when the time will begin. And then from there, Barbara and Dorothy will each follow with 5-minute stories each. Okay, I'm just checking the chat to make sure there aren't any questions or concerns. We do have someone from New Orleans is thanking us for using the Audre Lorde and John O'Neill work. So thank you. We really appreciate that. We are honored to share it with you all. So we can stop sharing the slide. Great. Okay. So again, I'm going to read the poem and then I'll tell a story. For the record, in memory of Eleanor Bumpers by Audre Lorde. Call out the colored girls and the ones who call themselves Black, and the ones who hate the word nigger, and the ones who are very pale, who will count the big fleshy women, the grandmother weighing 22 stone with rusty braids and a gap-toothed scowl, who wasn't afraid of Armageddon. The first shotgun blast tore her right arm off, the one with the butcher knife. The second blew out her heart through the back of her chest. And I'm going to keep writing it down, how they carried her body out of the house, dress torn up around her waist, uncovered, past tenants and the neighborhood children, and a mountain of Black woman. And I'm going to keep telling this if it kills me, and it might in ways I am learning. The next day, Indira Gandhi was shot down in her garden, and I wonder what these two 67-year-old colored girls are saying to each other now, planning their return, and they weren't even sisters. So I want to tell a story about my granny. So I called her Granny, but her mail, only reason I knew her full name was because of her mail. And it actually said Ida Mildred Dowdell. So that was her full name. But no one called her Ida or Mildred. Some people called her Miss Dowdell. Other people called her Chick or Aunt Chick. And there was also the nickname Miss Fort Lewis, which a previous version of my granny may have been known by that name from the stories that we were told growing up, but my generation never really met her. We only heard stories about her. And, you know, we flipped through photo books and picture albums and was able to see you know, what she might have been like through some of her poses, and she always looked really cute, and she always had, as far as back as I could see her photos, she always had that same gold tooth that seemed to shine as bright and in real life, as it did in those faded photos. And so sometimes I wonder about Aunt Chick, and I wonder about Miss Fort Lewis, who I knew as Granny, what she was like when she was younger. And as she got a little older and in her later years, once the dementia started to set in, I think a little bit of that part of her started to come back. And for me, it came back through her asking constantly for a cigarette because the granny that I knew didn't smoke cigarettes. And so for me, that was Aunt Chick or Miss Fort Lewis or somebody coming back to ask for that cigarette. But she never really asked plainly for a cigarette. She always used this phrase, which I still remember. I can still hear her saying it, give me a puff. And that obviously meant a drag of your cigarette. But I never smoked, so I never really had to tell her no, like my grandma was always telling our aunts and uncles to, you know, make sure that they didn't give her a cigarette at that point. But I do remember one time when she asked me for a cigarette and I told her I don't smoke. And she said, well, can you go to the store and get me a pack of Cool 100s? And I said, I can't, Granny, I'm not old enough. And I started to lie, and she immediately cut me off and said, I'll write you a note. And she responded, she said, I'll write you a note. And I responded, Granny, that doesn't work anymore. And, she insisted. So I agreed, and I took the note and I left out the front door, and I just waited for her to forget our conversation and start all over again with the next great grandchild. So that's what I think of when I think of my granny. And for some reason, this poem really just made me think of her and made me smile. And I will pass it on to Barbara.
Wow, that was lovely. I mean, that started to make me think about other stories than the one I was prepared to tell. We were sort of prompted to tell a story about home, and so I want to just say a little bit about where I come from and where I've ended up in terms of home. But my granny also factors into that. I grew up in Detroit in the 1970s, and I was adopted, which is not, people are like, oh, what does that mean to you? It actually doesn't mean a lot to me. I mean, my family was my family that I grew up with. There was no great mystery of who my blood relatives were. I knew who my people were, and they loved me and embraced me, and I was a part of them. But I grew up in Detroit in the 1970s, and I lived with my parents, who were working class Black folks from Georgia and Mississippi, and with my grandparents and my grandmother, who my daughter is partly named after. Her middle name is Rosa, which was my grandmother's name. Was very, very dear to me, and she just loved me with ferocity. She was not a sweet grandma. She was a tough grandma, and her love felt tough. Not tough in terms of putting restrictions on me, but just strong. Steel-willed love. So Detroit and my family were, what grounded me. It was what was familiar to me. It was what anchored me. And so it was very difficult when I left Detroit, because I was leaving behind, my fond memories of Motown and the Fox Theater, and, my father taking us to hear Michael Jackson, and talent shows in my school, and all the things that anchored and grounded me. Buy my first Black Panther newspaper. But in 1980, in the summer of 1980, the year Ronald Reagan would be elected president, which all bad things started to happen. I was very nervous, but I made a decision with my then boyfriend, and now husband of almost 40 years, to go to New York City. And it was a whole different world. And I remember we packed up our U-Haul truck, and my mother said to me, she said, oh my God, you're going to New York. It's so dangerous there. And of course I got to New York, and they say, you're from Detroit. It's so dangerous there. So the perceptions, based on what we're comfortable with, perceptions are very different. We packed up our U-Haul truck. We drove across, Ohio and Pennsylvania, and so New Jersey, and ended up in New York. And I remember driving into the Bronx and feeling like, oh my God, what have I done? I've left home. I've left home, and I'm in this unfamiliar place that is big and noisy and dirty, and most of all, unfamiliar. So I immediately had regrets and second thoughts and all kinds of fears. But over the course of the next, 4+ years, New York became my home. My first child was born there, which is, most special thing in my life at that point. I built community there, and I actually met people from around the world. I became a part of a community, mostly of Caribbean students. I was in school at Columbia, And there were students from Trinidad and Barbados and Jamaica, and they kind of embraced me. And they talked to me about what home meant to cross borders and to be in sometimes feeling really in hostile territory in this country, and what their parents had gone through who had migrated from, various places. So I began to rethink what home meant. Home didn't just mean the familiar. It just didn't mean my dad's barbecue and my grandma's, you know, uh, sweet potato pie. But it meant what you build with other people and going through difficulties, accomplishing things with people, going through political struggle with people, loving people, meeting new people. All of that is what creates home for us. And that's what created home for me in New York. And since that time, I've had two other home cities. I lived in Ann Arbor for a number of years, and then here in Chicago. And so, I think of Detroit as my home. It's changed an enormous amount since I left. I think of New York as my second home. Ann Arbor is one of my homes, and of course, Chicago is very close to my heart and is my home now for many years. So those were just some of my reflections about movement and mobility, and not only home is where we come from, but home is what we create. Uh, so
Thank you. That
that's
was
the
great.
story about me.
Just right on time too, right at 5 minutes. Wonderful job. Thank you. And Dorothy, would you like to tell us a story? Uh-oh, you lost your camera. We'd love
Oh,
to see your face.
okay. Let me try it again.
All right.
All right. Oh, it says something that the video, because the host has stopped it. Let's try it again. There we are.
There we are.
Okay. So, my story is about being the first person born in Chicago as part of the Great Migration. So my parents came from Mississippi, and they came from Mississippi because my father was a veteran, and he heard that there would be greater opportunities here in Chicago than there were there. They were sharecroppers there. And so when they came to Chicago, they first lived on the west side. Because my father was a veteran, he then was able to be placed into LeClaire Courts, which at the time had a very diverse population of people who were veterans in their families. When I was probably in 8th grade, I would hear people come to our house and they would say to my mother all the time, "When is the last time you went home?" And that meant, when is the last time you went back to Mississippi? And so I had never been to Mississippi until I got into the 8th grade. And so going to Mississippi really changed me and helped me to really become a person who learned how to live in community. Because living in high-rise public housing, which is what I was doing when I was in 8th grade, we were very uh, isolated in terms of who we communicated with. So we had really close friends in the building where we lived, but that was kind of our inner circle, and we really did not have a lot of friends outside of the building where we lived. And so when I went to Mississippi, I was staying with my grandmother, and my great grandmother lived about a mile away. And I remember walking from my great grandmother's house to my grandmother's house. And by the time I got to my grandmother's house, she had received 3 phone calls. And they said, "Irene, does that gal belong to you? You know, the one who's walking down the street, who's not talking to anybody, not speaking when she sees us sitting on the porch. Is that somebody who belongs to you?" And so my grandmother sat me down and she said, "When you see people
sitting on the porch, you acknowledge them. They are our family. They are our community. So you don't just walk past people, you acknowledge them and you treat them like their family. And so staying in Mississippi for that summer changed my whole life. When I came back to Chicago, I started speaking to people on the street. I started and I to this day, when I pass somebody on the street, hi, how you doing? Everything okay? Blah, 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 blah. According to my daughter, she said, you will talk to anybody. And I will. And she says, I've never seen people who get on the CTA bus and just start talking to strangers. And I don't initiate the conversations, but when someone starts the conversation, I continue it because that's the way I was brought up. And that to me is community. And community makes you feel at home. And so, that's my story about home, is I had to learn how to be in community to really feel at home, not just in Mississippi, but also in Chicago.
No, that's beautiful. As someone not originally from Chicago, but also has roots in the Midwest and the South, I can relate to so much about both of your stories. And it just, yeah, I mean, I love this process already. I don't know if I said this in the beginning, but this is my first time actually facilitating a storytelling circle. And unfortunately, it has to be in this circumstance where we can't be in the same room. But nonetheless, I'm just feeling the vibes. I'm feeling both of your energy and feeling like I familiar with your work, but just hearing you talk about your own personal lives, just feeling a new connection and appreciation for you and your work. So thank you so much. This has been so wonderful. It's as I said, I personally appreciate it, but I'm sure all of the folks watching and here with us feel similarly. We've gotten a lot of great comments in the chat box. If you want to check that out before you head on to your next thing, I encourage you to just feel the love there. And this, again, this video will also be on Facebook if you want to share it out going forward.
Can I say one sentence?
Yes, please.
Which is, what I think is also powerful about storytelling is how someone else's story brings out other things. And of course, as Dorothy told her story, there's so many parallels with my family in terms of Mississippi and my first trip to Mississippi when I was 9 and all of that. So I just want to thank you, Dorothy, for your story.
Oh, do you want to say anything, Dorothy? I just want to make sure we didn't cut you off. No, you're good. We can't hear you because you're on mute. I think I was on mute just a second ago.
Okay, I just wanted to say that I was so inspired by both of the stories that you guys told that I just really wanted to kind of share my family history as part of, my life story, because I mean, it really is who I am. I am the product of kind of being in the South and also being in public housing and, the activism that came from being in the South. And especially nowadays, the fact that my people were really, really focused on the right to vote, which was something that put their lives and their livelihoods in jeopardy. And so that's another thing that is just really important to me that I could probably talk about forever also. So thank you, guys.
Thank you for another event. Well, we'll definitely have you back. We look forward to it. And we also want to make sure we get that oral history as a part of our oral history archive, to continue to grow that as well. So yes, I would like to go ahead and say goodbye to our Facebook friends. We dropped the storytelling toolkit in the chat, so we want to encourage you all to go ahead and take advantage of that tool, and please continue this tradition and this practice of storytelling circles in your own communities, and just storytelling in general, and art, and just as much as we can inject life into all of the things that we do that we don't necessarily want to do, or just I think it makes life more interesting and exciting. So we want to make sure that you all can take care of that. And then for those of you on Zoom, we will continue to give you instructions, and we'll go ahead and also say goodbye to Dorothy and Barbara. Thank you again for your time. But everyone else, please hang out if you'd like to join our story circles.